Circle on the influence of the public sector. My name's Tom Fuller. I'm a union representative with the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. And it's good to see we're keeping up that grand old tradition of the union movement of being a buck short and a day late. But we will try to move through. Now, I want to say a couple of things about the way the Story Circle is meant to work. This is not really a discussion of theories or perspectives or analysis. This is people's stories and how events in the past have influenced people. Once the people from the panel at the front have told their stories, we're going to throw it open to the floor. But what we're really after from you people is not necessarily questions or comments or analysis, although obviously anything is fair game, but rather your own stories. So I will just quickly introduce the panelists, and we're going to have to pass this rather cumbersome object across. It is 2 mics in one. We're operating on redundant systems here. You'll notice that the panelists are all to my right from my perspective, but from your position, they're all to my left. So we'll have to work that out over the course of the morning. To my immediate right is Guy Smith, President of the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees.
Hello, this morning.
Next to Guy is Elisabeth Ballerman from the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. Jonathan Teghtmeyer from the Alberta Teachers Association. Connie Credico from the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And Greg McMaster from the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Someone who doesn't really need an introduction, because if you've been on a picket line in Alberta in the last 40 years, you have bumped into Greg. So I'm going to move this on as quickly as possible to get into the meat and potatoes of this, and I will start with a very short story of my own. And there are all different kinds of stories and all different kinds of lessons we can draw from our experiences. And right now I'm thinking about a day about 11 years ago, about 2 blocks from here. At this time of year, in fact, the Learneds were on at the University of Alberta at the time, I recall. The AUPE members in General Support Services at the University Hospital and the Glenrose Hospital, and the members in auxiliary nursing care at those hospitals had staged an illegal wildcat strike. I was assigned to the picket line at the University Hospital. It was a beautiful day about this time of year, and a lot of that kind of excitement and exuberance that you get on a strike line, especially the first day. And the employer's response was to try to engage in some fairly nasty intimidation tactics. So they had their security people driving around and videotaping everybody. And of course, for people who haven't got a lot of experience, it's an illegal strike that makes them nervous. Rather more nastily, they also had people from Human Resources out talking to the people on the picket line and trying to urge them to go back in. And what they were doing is they were targeting those of our members who they knew were landed immigrants working here. And they'd go to them and say, listen, you know, this is an illegal strike. Maybe you don't understand what that means. You're breaking the law by being on this picket line. And if you were charged, and if you were found guilty, you could potentially lose your landed immigrant status and be deported. So I was running around trying to sort of catch up to these people and say, get the hell off our picket line, but I was not having a lot of success. And one of the head HR people was giving this little talk to a small group of our members about 20 feet away. So I went charging over, and just before I got there, one of our LPNs walked up to him and said, and smiled, and he smiled back because HR people are friendly people. And she said, Tim, I think that was his name, Tim, I just want you to remember one thing. Someday you too will have to be catheterized. And he turned around and he walked back into the hospital. So that's my story. Draw the lessons you wish from it. I'm going to pass the mic across to Guy.
Well, thanks. When I realize I have to tell personal stories, it's hard to know which one to focus on, because what comes into my mind when I had to talk about this was struggle. The fact that I believe struggle builds strength. I believe that public sector unions on the front line are defending not just workers' rights, but the rights of people to receive public services and good quality public services. It's always been under threat and always under attack, and it's always the unions and the workers represented by the unions that are taking the front line struggle to the streets. So I'm going to go way back to when I first got involved in AUPE as a Local 6 member. So I worked in social services, and for me, the most defining moment in my life was 3 weeks spent in 1990 on an illegal strike. Social workers were on strike at that point. My work site was the first work site to walk out. I walked from home to the picket line, not knowing if anybody else would be there, and finding pretty much everybody was on the picket line. Spending those 3 weeks and learning about what it means to be on the front lines of the struggle for me was a huge learning experience. And that, I think, still resonates with me through to this day, where I found myself on the picket line this morning, because we have 2 strikes happening in Edmonton right now, and yelling at scabs now is just as fun as it was back in 1990. But there's been so much struggle, and I really, I don't think anybody likes to engage in the struggle. It's bloody tiring, and it's hard work. But at the end of the day, it really is what makes a strong union, whether they're public sector or private sector, is to engage in that struggle. And we saw as a union, as our union, huge attacks on us in the 1990s because of the Ralph Klein regime at the time, where we lost thousands of members. We were almost dead in the water as a union. We were, and the fact that we actually pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps and survived as a union, and after that continued to grow as a union, become stronger, to me is testament to the fact that if you're not on the front lines of the struggle, if you're not out there with your members fighting these fights, you're going to lose the battles that are inevitably going to come. So over the last 20 years, huge amounts of struggles, huge amounts of stories, but I can tell you, sisters and brothers, that the struggle continues. I know that we say that, but quite honestly, we're seeing now elements of attacks on public sector unions in particular, from one end of the country to the other. I was down in Wisconsin last week, and there's a whole other hours of stories I could tell about the struggle that's going on there. But the fact that, collective bargaining rights have made it illegal in the States, and the fact that, in that state and other states as well, and the fact that those same attacks could happen here means that the public sector unions, along with their activists and their stories and their history and their passion, their intensity and their struggle, the public sector unions will be the vanguard, if you like, of workers' rights for many years to come. And I just appreciate the fact that I get the opportunity to share some of my story and passion for that struggle with you guys this morning. Thanks very much.
I don't think it matters which way you point it or hold it.
I'm thinking of the suicide bomber, Anyway, good morning, everyone. I've got a couple of little notes here just to remind myself. So I think everybody can see me. I can see everybody. So I will stay seated. My union is the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. We were formed in 1971. We represent non-nursing, non-physician health professionals, and we are scratching 23,000 now as far as membership. When I first got involved in 1980, a colleague came up to me and said, we're trying to form a union. This is about a month after I started work. I'm a physical therapist. And we had a prof that came to one of our classes before I graduated who said, people, there are these things out there called unions. But you are professionals. And unions are for blue-collar workers. And therefore, you are to have nothing to do with unions. Apparently, I don't know that they examined on that, at least after the fact. I guess I would have not passed that class. My father was a farm laborer, and any of you who know about farm workers and how abused they are would know that therefore I saw a whole lot of abuse of workers when I was a child. A man who didn't have a vacation for more than 2 weeks vacation in 10 years, I swear to God. Every weekend, because you got to feed cattle and keep the animals alive. And so I saw how workers were badly treated. And when I joined the workforce, I, came into what was a CUPE, sorry, it was a long-term care facility, the Lamont Smoky Lake Auxiliary Hospital, where they told us, we follow the CUPE contract, but you're not unionized. But there it is, 3 8.5 by 11 sheets tacked to the bulletin board. And one day when I thought I was entitled to have time and a half for a shift, and they didn't pay me accordingly, they said, well, no, we don't do that. And I'm going, but Article 1803B, and so the whole row of health sciences people, some of you have heard that story, right? So there I learned, wait a minute, you got to have some rights. And then when I was told, after I finally said, but here it is, you told us we're following this, and they did pay me appropriately, then I started hearing, okay, Ballerman better learn to keep her mouth shut if she wants to keep her job. Apparently I didn't learn that lesson real well either, because my mouth hasn't been shut since. And so when we then came, I've graduated, my colleague comes to me, we're trying to form a union. For me, it was a no-brainer. Of course I'll sign up. And then I started reading the contract, and before long I'm a rep and going to an annual meeting. And one of the first first meetings that I went to was about 1981 or thereabouts. And I was incredibly puzzled because my union, the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, was voting to disaffiliate from something called Solidarity. Some of you who've been around long enough will remember that. I don't know enough about it because, of course, we disaffiliated at that point. And I'm going, what in the dickens is that about? Being part of a union to me seems to be you get together, you work together, you don't break apart efforts that have been trying to bring workers together. So for me, although I didn't grow up in a red diaper kind of family, it's been really intuitive to think that we have to work together. And through my life with health sciences, we've certainly been trying to do that. We have grown. When I started, we must have been about 2,000 members. Now we're 23,000 or thereabouts. We have a lot of influence. We reach the entire province. We're not restricted only to the public sector, but the pay, the benefits, the pensions that we all enjoy are so critical to us. And my union last year adopted a strategic plan, and everything that we do is now intended to take us in that direction. And the strategic plan says our members and the public will understand and value unions. And from what you've probably already heard, and I wasn't able to be here yesterday, you know that that's a huge goal. But everything that we're going to be doing is going to push us in that direction. And the first thing we have to do, of course, to get there is for our members to understand it, is that they have to get value for their union dollar. But we also understand that our interests are better served if the rest of the public also understands and values unions. So that's my story, and I'm sticking by it.
So I'll be honest, I don't think I completely understood the assignment, so I got 8 pages of notes, which I've now decided to throw on the ground and tell you my story. I was going to tell you the story of John Walker Barnett, who in pre-World War I and during World War I was looking at the work life of teachers, largely in one-room schoolhouses with single trustees that oversaw the operation of the school. Many of them were living in teachers or living in the schools themselves. They'd have to wake up early, gather the wood, put it into the fireplace, and they were looked upon by the trustees as, in many ways, hired help. And so John Walker Barnett saw a lot of issues, and he traveled across the province in an open-top Ford to meet with teachers, to represent teachers, and to sign them up for the Alberta Teachers Association. And that really is the story that originates our organization. But for Barnett and for all of us in the association, this idea of a tension between being a professional and being a union has sort of always existed, but we see the value of both pieces of those supporting each other. We can't be a good profession unless we've got a good union backing it up, and we can't be a good union unless we focus on ourselves as professionals. And so those things, I think, fit very well together, and they're very important. The other story I was going to tell you about was a teacher that got fired from his job in 1934, along with a number of other teachers in Calgary Public that got fired at the time. And they decided to go into politics. And that teacher, William Aberhart, became the next premier of the province. And he put forward a Teaching Profession Act, or he improved on the Teaching Profession Act that was put forward just before him being elected, and made sure that teachers had a code of ethics in place. And made sure that teachers had a pension plan. And this all came from the root of, at the time, the Alberta Teachers Alliance, and after that, the Alberta Teachers Association. But let me get to my story. And I think the best place to start with my story is looking at sort of the mid-90s. I don't remember the exact year. I want to say that it was 1995. But my dad, who was an AUPE member, and he was I think he was a local president at the time, invited me out for dim sum. I'd never been to dim sum, and that we'd go down to the legislature afterwards. And I don't think I quite understood exactly what was going on. But I met some neat people at dim sum. I enjoyed dim sum, and then all of a sudden there we were on Jasper Ave, and it wasn't just a group of 10 of us. Now there was hundreds of us. And as we walked down Jasper Ave, it became thousands of us. And we ended up on the steps of the legislature, and the amount of energy and excitement that was there, even though it was rooted in a little bit of anger at the government, there was such incredible energy and I think hope at a time where there was a lot of despair. And that really captivated me, and it grabbed me. And I think at that point, I sort of always became a unionist. And then and at that point, just to put in there a bit of what the ATA was doing at that time, a lot of the narrative that was being developed was about how the public sector wasn't working, and in particular, public education wasn't working. And so the Alberta Teachers Association in 1995 founded the Public Education Action Centre. And that was all focused on pushing out the message that public education works. The system is not broken, it needs supports, public education works. And that campaign, that Public Education Action Centre, the Apple checkmark logo, if you remember that, became a nationwide symbol of the value of public education and the need to support it. In 1997, I wasn't there, unfortunately, but 15,000 teachers rallied on the legislature grounds in support of public education. So I became a teacher. And in 2002, in my second year of teaching, 2/3 of the teachers in this province ended up on strike. My local was a couple of days away from going on strike before the government ordered them all back to work. And in this whole period, very stressful times, I was looking at the ATA website every day, trying to get the most up-to-date information, and I was looking around at the different organizations in education, asking myself the question, who here is doing the best job to stand up for education? And I looked at my school board. No, it wasn't them. I looked at the government. Definitely wasn't the government. It was the ATA. The ATA was standing up the most for public services, for public education, and that to me said, I need to work for the ATA. I need to work with the ATA. They deserve my time and energy. And so I think that the moral of that story is that the best thing that we can do as public sector unions is protect, stand up, and advocate for the public services that we're providing, and we will always be in good stead, and we'll always be gaining new people and new energy. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Connie Credico, and I'm the Regional Director for Alberta for CUPE. It's bizarre. I've always been in a position of always being the youngest. Over the years, I'd always been the youngest of everybody that was there in the group, and so everybody else would be a few years older, and they'd have far more history. And I'm listening to the years come out, and oh goodness, my years started earlier than that, way earlier. So anyway, I did start out very young, though. Some would like to say the age of 12. I'd like to say at the age of 12, but it was pretty close, actually. I think I was 17. When I first became a union member, I was working for the city of Lethbridge. I was a lifeguard for the city of Lethbridge. This is in the mid-70s. And I, of course, went to union meetings because that's the way I was brought up. My dad was a letter carrier, and we just came from that kind of a work, just kind of a household, you know, my aunt and uncle. Everybody talked about going to the union meeting. At that time, I assumed everybody who worked also belonged to a union, and going to the union meeting was part of your job. That's the way that I was raised. That's the way that I understood it to be. So I would go to these meetings. I didn't know what was going on. I had no idea who, take no offense anyone. I can say this now, I'm one of the old guys. Anyways, so I'd look at these three old guys at the front, and I had no idea who they were with their briefcases pushed up in front of them. But, you know, I sat there dutifully every month and went to the meeting and listened to what was going on and got more, I guess, involved or got thinking about what kinds of things needed to be done for my workplace, the lifeguards and the recreation, who had been largely ignored. In those days, what happened in a lot of the public sector agreements is that it was largely run by outside workers. So it was still typically blue-collar type of thinking, blue-collar kind of way of running it. I don't like calling it blue-collar, but I'll pick up on what Elisabeth said because that there is a thread there that makes sense. And that is the way that it was thinking was also the way that it ran for the public sector. So if you came from one of those other groups, the inside workers or recreation, that was a little different. So my initial thinkings was to be able to do something for the lifeguards and try and get some, you know, things like guaranteed hours of work in the summer, and some uniforms, things like that, and representing them in grievances. So of course I got involved in those things, did more of those things, filed many grievances I think in my first summer that ended up going to arbitration. And it ended up, and as I got more involved, I ended up seeing more things that needed to be addressed. Our collective agreement with the city of Lethbridge actually was comprised of 3 collective agreements that had never really been merged. It was an inside worker, it was an outside worker, and there was recreation provisions. There was really no blending of how those rights would actually work with each other. So that was one of my goals. I couldn't find any of the guys to run for president, so I ran for president. The local was made up of 10 bargaining units throughout the South and about 1,000 members. I was still quite young at the time. Anyways, of course, you know, when you're young and, you know, you see things pretty black and white. So you see all these things needed to be changed, so we're going to change it all. And so we went on strike 2 years later to change it all. But some of the things that existed at the time, one of the things that wanted to get fixed was the inside workers. They had a job evaluation plan that this isn't that long. It doesn't seem like that long ago. It's in my lifetime. But anyways, they had their job evaluation plan had all these factors, and it would come down to certain points. And then it would divide into, you know, where you'd get actually the pay grade. Then you would add 2 if you were male, if it was a male position, and -3 if it was a female position. We're talking this existed, technically it still existed on the books, still in 1980. So that was part of what we wanted to correct when we went on strike in 1981, was to get rid of that and actually come up with a whole different classification system that would more accurately reflect. And I'd like to say, gee, we did it all, but of course, pay equity still got a long ways to go. But we made a lot of groundwork, we made a lot of moves towards doing that. We made a lot of moves towards recognizing other jobs, such as lifeguards and other positions that have more responsibility, and making them get paid, or allowing them to get paid, enabling them to get paid much more than way below the labor's rate of pay. That was the big thing in the early 80s that we tried to do for equal pay. We tried to get clerk typist positions and other positions at least up to the level of a laborer position. So, but interesting, one of the other things, because this has influenced the public sector, one of the other things that came up during the strike in '81, one of our interests in public sector is to talk about, we try to protect our jobs from being privatized, from being contracted out. And that at that time was seen as a very different interest than what the private sector unions, the big industrial unions, would have. And so one of the proposals, of course, that we had on the table was dealing with contracting out. Man, I had visitors from, you know, vice presidents from Washington and from wherever coming in their 3-piece suits asking about particular clauses we had on the table and what that was going to mean to them. And I was kind of taken back by all that. Like, what possible? We're just talking about our own people trying to, you know, protect our own work. Of course you can construct the new water treatment plant. We have no intention of building the new water treatment plant. We're just trying to protect our own work. But it was kind of interesting to see a whole nother world that was really not the same at all with our kind of union or what we were like. It was a very different world for them. We talked about defining moments, and it was interesting because of what you said. I'd like to to bring one up. That was probably the biggest defining moment for me in my involvement. I wasn't quite president yet, but I was getting pretty active at the time. And the Federation of Labor would always do this annual presentation to the legislature about different issues that are of concern for people. And so all the unions would come and we would do our big presentation. It was in November that year. And I had come from the thinking, and I was one of those members that thought politics and unions didn't belong together, and that we shouldn't go to union meetings and talk about politics because that was really a very separate thing. You know, I was very good Albertan, that stuff is very private and kept to my heart and all that stuff, eh? Anyway, so we go to the ledge that day, and we're talking about these concerns, but this seemed different to me. This didn't seem like politics. We're talking about nursing homes and private nursing homes and what terrible care this is for people, and, you know, it just didn't seem right, and those kinds of issues, and what minimum wage should be, and I didn't think that was politics. I thought that was just, of course, concerns everybody had. Anyway, so we all go to the ledge, and this was at the time in CUPE, all the hospital workers were moving into provincial bargaining. It's in the late 70s. And so it was a big, a rising dispute with the provincial government at the time. And what they did at the front door is, if you were from CUPE, you weren't allowed in the building. Everybody else was. I was just floored. I couldn't believe it. How could this possibly be? I live in Alberta. I've never been to the ledge before in my life. It was my first time, and you're telling me I'm not allowed to come into the legislature? Boy, that penny dropped that day. That penny dropped for me very clearly. I got the connection. We did get in, by the way, eventually, you know, and everybody's all very polite. Some guy, MLA turned, oh, did you get a coffee? Coffee? Couldn't even get in the building, but anyway, so it was, that was quite a defining moment for me about making the connections about who we are as a labor movement and what our concerns are and how we do have these shared concerns and what we need to do to go forward. So.
Guess I'll get up here and feel a bit more comfortable. I am not feeling that well today, though, so just bear with me. A little bit about the postal workers. I guess everyone here is familiar in the post-war economic boom. There was the expansion of the state and the public sector. So the various associations that grew with that joined the ranks of the labor movement that previously had been based on the trades and the industrial unions from the 1930s and 40s. And so one by one, in different times, different places, these associations turned themselves into unions. And of course, the postal workers in 1965 were part of that. And I had just a little insight into that. I was only 16 at the time, didn't care at all about unions, but although I was a member of the United Mine Workers for a little while at a CIL paint factory in Toronto. But we came across at our place in Ontario with some old newspapers in the woodpile. Came across a Globe and Mail from August 1965, which gave me a little insight into what things were like back then. And what the entire front page was, Teamsters Wildcat Strike Sweeping Ontario. So this was like a few days before the postal strike, and the atmosphere was just wild in this newspaper article. So it was like looking back in time and seeing what the what the atmosphere was like at that time in 1965. And Jimmy Hoffa was coming in from Washington to put a stop to it as well. That was sort of funny. So the postal strikes took place. They were called Wildcat strikes as well, but that sort of implies there was no leadership, but there really was leadership. It was against the national unions. And I'm telling this story even though I wasn't there, because it's kind of our story up to this day even. There was leadership. The leadership was the local leadership of the letter carriers union and the inside workers, the Canadian Postal Employees Association in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, who led that strike and supported each other and are still, still at it today with the situation we faced just last June. So, okay, and then just on to a story of my first years of involvement in the Federation and the public sector there. The first union AFL meeting I went to in 1979 was the Committee on Political Education, it was called. And it was all men. There was one woman there, Gloria Hogue from the Inside Workers. I was there from the letter carriers. And there was me and a couple other guys in blue jeans. The rest of it was all men in suits. And it was quite incredible. And the president of the Federation was from the old generation of the industrial unions, namely Harry Kostiak from the packing house. He was UFCW by that time. And the secretary treasurer was the full-time, he was the executive secretary, was the full-time position. Harry wasn't full-time. And that was Eugene Mitchell from the building trades. So that was the face of the Federation in 1979. The public sector was getting involved, but there was a public sector caucus, and there was always this constant conflict that was posed in terms of public sector, private sector. But it's really like religion and politics. It's the envelope of the struggle, the form it took. It was really a left-right thing is what it was, and that became more clear to people as the time went on. And so that was 79. By the mid-80s, the president of the Federation was from CUPE, Brother Whirlin. So, and I just wanted to finish with one thing that I always found interesting, and I sort of saw it unfold in front of my eyes when I was there in the first few years, was the airline unions. And public sector, you wouldn't think so now, but Air Canada was a Crown corporation at the time, and they were associations as well. But they were affiliated to the Federation. There was the Canadian Airline Employees Association, CALIA, and there was the Flight Attendants, Canadian Airline Flight Attendants Association. And they were both quite involved. I can't remember the individuals' names, but they were quite active in the Federation. And over the years, they turned themselves, I mean, they were pretty well union already, I guess, but they became part of the broader labor movement in a different way, and the CALIA became part of the auto workers, and of course, CALFA became part of CUPE. So that was an interesting experience as well. And that's about it.